Hello, everyone, and welcome into Tunnel Vision, a show presented to you by USCFootball.com. I'm your host, Jack Smith, joined in studio by Connor Morrissette, a two-man Tunnel Vision as we preview USC heading east to take on Maryland. It's the eastmost trip for USC this year as the Trojans are just desperate for a Big Ten road win and a win to get their season on the right track, sitting at 3-3. But Connor, great to be with you, and I'm excited again to preview another big Big Ten game for USC.
Yes, another Big Ten game. I'm right there with you, Jack. 3-3 teams desperate for a win. Maryland's in that same boat, so we got a lot to talk to. But USC, of course, that 7 to 7.5 point favorite. I haven't looked at the updated line, but they were 7.5 point favorites earlier in the week. It's a game that USC needs to win, of course. Being a big favorite, being 3-3. Like I said on Wednesday, I don't know if a lot of USC fans will buy back in with this season if USC wins, but you'll lose a heck of a lot more people if you lose. So big game in that regard, and just big game for the team to get back on track.
As always, if you are watching live on Tunnel Vision, whether it's on Facebook or YouTube, you can leave your comments in the chat. We'll be able to throw those on the screen. We have one from our 247 colleague Chris Trevino. Been waiting all day for this. This is a big week for Chris with it's a homecoming for him, going back to Maryland where he went to school, and so it's Chris Trevino week, and he's been out there in Maryland all week, so not able to have him on the show today. Just Connor and I. But like Chris, if you guys want to leave your comments, we can put those on the screen. We will not be doing live callers today. We'll have to wait for the post game show for that. But as always, leave any comments or especially questions that you guys have. If you've had questions throughout the year that we haven't been able to get to on a packed show, this is the one to put them in, because Connor and I will go over those at the end of the show, and you can rattle off any questions you have, whether it's about USC football, recruiting, basketball. As basketball season starts to come a little bit closer, feel free to leave any questions or comments that you guys have in there. But Connor, I think that the main storyline going into this one for USC, it doesn't matter who's on the other side. It doesn't really matter who the opponent is. I said it on Instant Analysis. USC is like a shooter at the beginning of a game right now. They really just need to see one fall through, because this is a group that has been right there in each of its 3 losses and has fallen short to Michigan, to Minnesota, and now to Penn State last week. It just feels like, doesn't matter who it's against, USC needs a win right now to try and get the season moving in the right path.
A win on the road, too, of course. Haven't had that this year. But, yeah, I'm with you, Jack. And after a loss to Penn State, where if USC wins that game, the perception's a lot different. You just beat a top 5 team in the country. And, yes, you have the 2 losses still, but you still sort of control your own destiny a little bit with the college football playoff. I'm sure a lot of players in that game being up 20-6 at halftime and being up by 7 with about 6 minutes to go in the fourth quarter, we're thinking, okay, we're right back. We're back on track. And then to not see that through, I'm wondering what the effects of that will be against Maryland. The best players not only do really well in the field, but that whole mental side as well, where you just have to block that stuff out, focus on the game. Lincoln Riley talked so much this week about having that 1-0 mentality, but after suffering 3 losses, the way USC has, you have to wonder what kind of group we'll get this week. And to me, that kind of, we'll look at the start of the game. How well does USC do early? If it's a sluggish start, maybe they're still feeling the effects. If not, they've moved on and they're ready to go. And, of course, we want to see how they finish as well, because in those 3 losses, giving up the 14 points to Minnesota, that big run to Michigan to give up the touchdown, and then, of course, the touchdown and then field goal to Penn State to lose. USC's had some issues starting games this year, but they've also had some issues finishing games. So we can get into the X's and O's, the matchup, the key players and all that, but just from a 10,000-foot view, I'm curious to see how USC does just mentally, because they've been through a lot already, and I imagine the stress is pretty high in that locker room.
Yeah, I went on a Maryland radio show today, and they said, for USC to have a successful second half of the season, whether that's 5-1 or 6-0, what needs to happen? What do they need to change? And I said that's probably the most infuriating question, the most annoying question inside the USC building and facility. I don't think they need to change a whole ton, and I think they've done some good things to get change on the offensive line, see improvement in that area, but it's really come down to they just need to be the team that makes the play at the end. I think in their 3 losses, they've been the team that flinches first or makes a mistake that leaves the door open. When you look at maybe Michael Lance's missed field goal in overtime, or the one missed tackle against Michigan, Mason Murphy allowing the pressure and the ensuing interception against Minnesota, USC has been the team that has flinched first and lost each of those 3 close games. On the other side, in week 1, we thought the team's identity was going to be this team is going to win the big games, and they're going to fight, and they're going to win the close ones because of what we saw at the end against LSU. So I don't think they need to make a ton of changes, and I don't really know as a coach what you can do to get back to that point, but it just feels like USC needs to return to that week one form where the guys are stepping up. They're the ones making the play at the end. Now, of course, you don't want to be in a one-play game every single week, especially against a Maryland team that has struggled a lot this season. I know the record at 3-3 is the exact same, but not the same schedule up to this point. Maryland's 3 wins have come against basketball schools, UConn, Virginia, and Villanova. USC has had to play one of the tougher schedules in America, but when they asked me that question, I said, I don't think they need to change a whole lot. They just somehow need to find a way to make that one play at the end of games, because that has been what has burned them in each of the 3 losses.
I look at trench play as something that can improve, but it's not like, oh, if you do this schematically, you'll be so much better. It's just guys needing to step up, and if your pass rush is better against Penn State, you probably win that game, and we all remember the offensive line miscues against Michigan, although I do acknowledge the offensive line has been better in recent weeks. Antonio Morales of The Athletic, I thought, made a really good point. You have to be able to run the ball when the other team knows you want to run the ball to see out games. And USC, for all the success they've had on the ground, and sometimes it's been Riley not calling those plays, those are 2 factors. USC hasn't been able to run the ball in some key points of the year where they've had opportunities maybe to see some games out. So I look at trench play, but it's not like someone's going to get healthy here and come in and make a big difference. USC sort of is what it is right now. That offensive line, there's no one on the bench that can come out and help. And like I said, they've been better, but Elijah Page continues to struggle a little bit. He gave up 4 pressures again against Penn State and had a low pass blocking grade according to Pro Football Focus. So he is taking some steps. That line is taking some steps. But USC and Lincoln Riley did some things to help mitigate the pass rush of Penn State by putting a tight end at the line of scrimmage, running backs, just doing a lot of stuff with that. So I wonder if that'll continue against the Maryland team that, of course, isn't quite as good as Penn State. But the pass rush, Jack, needs to get a lot better. And with Anthony Lucas being out for the year, that's just such a tough blow. Even though he didn't have a sack, he was clearly the team's best edge rusher. The team's 2 best pass rushers now, Eric Gentry and Lucas, are out for the year. So this team needs people to step up. The schedule does soften here a little bit these next few weeks. Maryland's offensive line is not that good. So there is an opportunity here for the pass rush to step up. But to your point, like, what can you do differently? I just don't know if they have the guys needed to be able to make that key sack. Hopefully they do against Maryland, because like I said, this offensive line is not as talented as some of the ones they faced this year. So maybe you get a couple of sacks, and then that means you're cooking with gas, you're going, it's a jumping off point. But I don't know if, like, Danton Lynn, why aren't you doing this? He's sort of just doing the best he can right now with what he's got.
Yeah, I was going to ask you before we get into Maryland. We did have 2 big pieces of news come out over the last couple of days. First of all, from Lincoln Riley on Tuesday, that Anthony Lucas will be gone for the season. They do expect to have him back next year, but it was a lower extremity injury that he suffered at the end of the game against Penn State. It looked like, I believe on a play, he got called for roughing the passer too. So it's a double whammy, especially when you see the replay and realize that was kind of a ticky-tack call and a flop by Drew Aller. But Lucas, as you mentioned, the team's best edge rusher, out for the season, and Eric Gentry, who we had kind of heard might have been deciding to redshirt because he suffered 2 concussions in the span of 3 weeks, and you never want to play around with concussions, especially for a guy like him where he's in his last year of eligibility. So the decision to redshirt now means he gets another one and can come back next year. But I think if you're looking at the USC defense, that is the best player at the front of the defense, best player in the middle of the defense, and I think 2 of the overall 3 best players on the defense when you include Kamari Ramsey. So USC this week alone lost 2 of its 3 best defensive players. And earlier in the season, the guy that everyone thought was the best defensive player coming into the year, Bear Alexander, of course, stepped aside and stepped away from the team and is redshirting himself. How impactful, I guess, do you think the loss of Lucas and Gentry will be? I know Gentry maybe wasn't expected to play in this week's game, obviously, but just horrible news for USC, especially knowing that they're losing guys in the positions that they need guys to step up at, and your top options have now been removed.
Oh, it's massive, and we saw it at the end against Penn State. If Anthony Lucas is in on the quarterback instead of maybe Jamil Muhammad, does he bring Aller down and USC gets a stop on 4th down and wins the game? We'll never know, but you'd prefer to have him in that position than Jamil Muhammad. I think that's fair to say. So tough break in that regard with Lucas going out and missing the end of that Penn State game. And, I mean, how many times has this defense been one play away from winning games? And Eric Gentry, probably the team's best playmaker, maybe Kamari Ramsey or Gentry, we could argue about that. But to me, I think Eric Gentry this year in the games that he played sort of solidified himself as the top playmaker. So they're massive losses, absolutely. The fun thing now going forward is, and that's what I love about college football, that next man up mentality. It's a true freshman, a kid who was just in high school who's going to step up. And you look at Desmond Stevens at the linebacker spot. He played 16 snaps against Penn State, had the interception. He ran it back, I think, 42 yards. He looked awesome in that game, and that's a player that USC fans can get excited about, even though he's inexperienced. And then with the Anthony Lucas replacement, it's going to be a lot of the older guys, but maybe now Cameron Fountain, the top-ranked recruit in USC's 2024 class on defense, I believe, will get an opportunity to rush the passer a little bit after not really getting too many chances, only playing against Utah State. So again, it's, you're not exactly where you want to be, and USC's dealt with some tough losses here on that defense due to injuries. But hey, it's not like they are really in trouble because they haven't recruited well enough at those two key spots. We could talk about other positions where I don't think they've recruited as well, but at defensive end, hey, you got a next man up here in Cameron Fountain at linebacker. Desmond Stevens is a guy who rose dramatically at the end of his high school career. He's someone who people were really, really excited about, and you could kind of see why. Now these guys will get bigger roles. Maryland on the road, it's a tough spot, but it could be a lot worse, as we all know. If these guys can get going and lead USC to maybe a 5-1 or 6-0 end of the year here, then all of a sudden people will be all excited again, and you have these guys for 2 more years, maybe even longer after that. So big opportunity for these guys, and that's what I love about college football. Unfortunately, injuries happen at all levels, but it's that next man up mentality, like I said, and USC's done a nice job recruiting at those 2 spots, and we'll see some of their top recruits play in this game.
Yeah, we heard from Danton Lynn that Cam Fountain may be a guy that's still a little bit raw, and we mentioned on Instant Analysis yesterday that he was maybe pouring a little bit of cold water on the idea that Cam Fountain would immediately come in and play a ton of snaps just because Anthony Lucas was out. But I thought hearing Lincoln Riley today just rave about Desmond Stevens as a guy that's consistently gotten better, guy that came onto their radar last year. He gave credit to Dave Emmerich and the scouting department for finding Desmond Stevens. And then, of course, he rose and rose, and he was recruited to USC when USC didn't really know what it was going to do on the defensive side of the ball in terms of coaching changes, bringing in Danton Lynn and, of course, bringing in later Matt Entz and some of the other assistant coaches, but that they really had a plan for Desmond Stevens. He came in, and I had a chance to talk to him on Wednesday about the fact that right now he's just trying to figure out still how to be a student athlete, how to balance living in Los Angeles, how to balance going to class, how to balance being a football player and learning from everybody. But that's a guy where you really see the talent, and you start to think about, yes, this is year 3 for Lincoln Riley. Maybe what do years 4 and 5 look like? If they can get players like Desmond Stevens coming in a little bit more often in the recruiting classes, then you start to see where this program could potentially go. But I think you definitely see him as a future face of the defense. The question is, down the stretch of the season against these smart Big Ten teams, can freshmen hang, basically, is the question you're going to be asking. And USC will need them to, whether it's Desmond Stevens, Jade Abasiri on the defensive line. You're going to see some of these true freshmen, I think specifically on defense, not as much at all on offense. You're going to see those guys get inserted more into the defense, and that's probably one of the top storylines for USC the rest of the way. How can these true freshmen hang with some of these other players? And we've seen them across other teams. The Minnesota safety that picked off Miller Moss to win the game. He also picked off a pass against UCLA. I think he's got 4 picks. He's a true freshman. So it's not that these players can't get it done. It's just that you're asking a lot of guys. And Lincoln Riley did mention on Tuesday, that's one thing he's just really excited about is when these guys go down with injury, he's fired up for the next guy that gets an opportunity.
And with Stevens, I'm excited to see what he looks like against the run, because I feel like that's sort of the next step in his development. Only had the 16 defensive snaps against Penn State. A few plays I didn't think he was in the right gap in the run game, but what can you expect? He's a guy who's so raw and so new, and Danton Lynn said, we're going to play freshmen because we trust them, and so it's clear that Stevens is trusted right now. So that's sort of the next step for him, and if Maryland runs the ball against USC, that won't be a very good thing because Maryland's really struggled to run the ball this season. But you wonder, with the attrition that USC's dealt with on their defensive line, in their linebacking core, if a Maryland will have some success. It's not like, USC, they're in all this trouble. They're just undermanned right now. So that's a big part of this game that I'll be looking at. If you look at what Minnesota was able to do this season, they've had a lot of struggles on the ground, and of course they ran really well against USC. Maryland, it's sort of in that same vein. I think the Minnesota back is better than the Maryland back, but it's similar in the sense that Maryland really hasn't been able to run the ball. They had one good output against Indiana, but outside of that, in 5 of their games, they don't have a guy who's gotten to 100 yards. They've only had one 100-yard carry or one 100-yard running back in a game this season. If you're USC, yes, you're undermanned, but try to keep that trend going and don't let a Maryland team that struggled on the ground establish the run at home.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting is just looking at the numbers solely in terms of yardage. These two teams are pretty similar. I believe they're 1 and 2 in pass attempts in the Big Ten, with USC being 1 and Maryland being 2. So Maryland's a team that also likes to throw the ball a lot. Maybe that's not what you think about when you think about these trips where USC is going to be heading into these colder weather areas, but Maryland's a team that likes to throw it around. You have Ty Felton as their leading receiver, and the rushing yardage is about the same per game between USC and Maryland. The difference is Maryland's run the ball for like 4.5, maybe 5 yards a carry for most of the season. USC's 2 running backs, Woody Marks is around that 7 to 8 yards per carry range. Quentin Joyner leads the Big Ten and is 3rd in the nation with nearly 10 yards per carry. USC has been efficient running the football, whereas Maryland has been very inefficient, and I think they run it for about the same amount of yardage per game. So you look at the specific numbers and you want to make a comparison like these two teams have similar run games. USC's is far better. I still continue to feel week by week like USC's not exactly leaning on the run enough. And I know that Lincoln Riley always produces great quarterbacks and has, for the most part in his career, always had great receivers and a hallmark passing game. I kind of wonder if this is the team that, Connor, is better on the ground than through the air. And Lincoln Riley has told us point blank he likes his offense to be run first. I guess I'll believe it when I see it, and I feel like this is a team that could have success with a plan like that.
Especially with Quentin Joyner as a really good second running back. It's not like I felt like USC last year, they were in the position where you put in Marshawn Lloyd and you just hope he doesn't get hurt because he's so good. What do they really have behind him? Now with Quentin Joyner, he's taken the next step clearly. He had the 75-yard touchdown against Penn State. Yes, the fumble against Minnesota, that was unfortunate, and that maybe cost him a little bit of playing time going forward. But to your point, Jack, USC's been throwing the ball all around the yard. It hasn't really worked too well to this point in Big Ten play. So if USC and Riley do choose to run the ball more, yes, Woody Marks will, of course, be a big factor in that, but Quentin Joyner only played 10 offensive snaps against Penn State. He's a guy who I think deserves to play a lot more. Again, if he fumbles, then that's a different story. But he's pretty clearly proven what kind of a weapon he is. Scoring 2 touchdowns on those 10 offensive plays is so impressive. So I do wonder, Jack, if maybe now that USC is 3-3, do we see a bit of a identity change with the receivers maybe kind of struggling the way no one really expected them to struggle, and the running backs being, I don't want to say what we expected, probably better what we expected. The offensive line clearly has done a better job run blocking this year than pass blocking. So maybe Riley now with 3 losses, and even though they have had some close defeats, does he decide to change some things? I could see it, and I think that starts with Quentin Joyner, because Woody Marks, he's going to get that 15 to 20 carries every game. But if you give Joyner a few more, kind of balance the load a little bit, if USC does choose to run the ball more, I think his role will get bigger, and he deserves it.
Yeah, I think I would make the exact same point. In Lincoln Riley's career, his backup running back has averaged about 99 to 100 carries a season. We're halfway through the year, and Quentin Joyner only has 30 carries. And we've seen what he's done with them. And Lincoln Riley has made the point to us before that it's more about what he's doing when the ball isn't in his hands. That'll get him on the field a little bit more. So that's running routes and specifically pass blocking. In order to have your backup running back out there, you have to trust that he can do more than just carry the ball. But you look at Quentin Joyner, just what he's done with the ball in his hands, and I agree. I just feel like he needs to get more touches. He got his first 2 touches against Penn State were touchdowns in the first half and only got 3 more the rest of the game. That just feels like a guy that you could use a little bit more, especially if you're looking for a spark offensively. And that's not to take away from Woody Marks. Woody Marks has already set a career high in rushing yards in a season. He did it in 6 games. He's been phenomenal. I really like the way he runs the ball. But I do feel like if you're looking at the positions, the running backs are so much stronger than the receivers right now. It's like if Quentin Joyner was a receiver, he'd absolutely be seeing time on the field. But just because he's behind Woody Marks, who's maybe been the offensive MVP of the season so far, it's tougher for him to get some run. But I think I would welcome an identity change, and I think it's something that USC should think about, is being a run-first team. It makes Miller Moss's job easier. We've seen him become far less efficient in the pass game in terms of just completion percentage since entering Big Ten play. I feel like USC would benefit from running the ball a little bit more. And Lincoln Riley kind of says that to us post-game at times, but it still doesn't feel like they're fully committed. It's like one bad run will get them away from the run for a little bit, and they'll pass the rest of the drive and maybe end up having to settle for 3 or they won't score. But I feel like that is something that we could see from USC.
With Marks, too, he's battled injuries in his career, and he's stayed healthy at USC to this point. I feel like getting Joyner more involved, too, could help keep Marks fresh down the stretch of the season where you're really going to need both of these running backs, especially in this physical Big Ten conference. So that, to me, is another part of this. And what's been interesting, too, Jack, we all sort of thought of Marion Peterson would be that third running back, and Brian Jackson has that locked down. And if USC does decide to run the ball more, maybe we see him. And maybe Zachariah Branch could potentially get involved in some running plays as well in an effort to sort of get him started. So I don't think Riley will change a whole lot. He said on Trojans Live, I'm not changing. Why change anything to this point? I think that's more dangerous. You can do more harm than good that way. Of course, we need to work on the things we're not as good at right now, but philosophical changes, I don't really agree with that. So I'm skeptical that we'll see it, but could he lean a little bit more on the run? Absolutely. And Maryland, it's just an average team. With all due respect to the Terrapins, with all due respect to Chris, they're just not that great of a team. They have a great receiver in Ty Felton. They have a great interior defensive lineman. I think his last name is Birch or Branch or something. They have one really good big guy in the middle and a few playmakers here or there. But this is a team that, on paper, USC really should be able to do some damage against. Running the ball, throwing the ball. Defensively, they should be able to get to the quarterback. Their quarterback, I think, is solid in Billy Edwards, but nothing special. This is a game where even though USC is undermanned with some injuries, they need to go out and make plays. And there's a reason, even though USC's 3-3, they're favored by 7.5 points in this game on the road. Maryland is down this year. Mike Loxley, like I said Wednesday, it kind of seems like it's getting a little bit stale with him here. This is the game USC absolutely just needs to play better and win and have some explosive plays and defensively make some eye-popping plays. Get people back in.
Are you putting much stock into USC making its furthest trip of the year? They're 0-2 in Big Ten road games. We've heard the stat ad nauseum that Big Ten teams traveling 2 or more time zones. I don't remember what the exact record is up to now, but it's very bad. USC makes it about as far a trip as it's going to make in this new Big Ten. How much stock are you maybe putting into the trip that they have to make east, and also the adjustments that they're making in terms of travel schedule?
That good defensive lineman is Jordan Phillips, by the way, not Birch or Branch. I don't know where I got that.
Jordan Birch is at Oregon.
Okay, then that's where I got that. Thank you, Jack. It's like you're in my head. With the travel, how can you not talk about it a little bit? I've sort of agreed with Riley the whole way, where I don't know how much the travel affects USC winning games. That's what he said, the ability for USC to win games, how much the travel affects that. But 0-2 on the road when you've traveled over the 2 time zones already. So I think we have to talk about it a little bit. And if USC loses this game, then it's absolutely a factor. It's kind of like what we talked about 2 weeks ago on the show when the teams traveling 2+ time zones were 1-8. If Penn State loses and Ohio State loses, of course they ended up splitting. But if those teams both lose, then let's really put this under the microscope, because that travel probably is a little bit more of a challenge than we say it is. So, again, I really don't think it makes that big of a difference. But if USC can't win on the road again, and you look at it, and all 3 games have been pretty lengthy flights, then sure, I'll talk about it more. It's just something that's really hard to quantify. So I don't really know exactly how big of an impact it has, but I mean, the more the losses stack up, then it's absolutely a factor. I think we have to say it is.
And Maurice on YouTube is saying USC needs to fly out on Thursday, not on Friday. I don't know if you heard from Curt Cignetti this week, the Indiana head coach. His philosophy is leave as late as possible. Indiana's 6-0. If USC was 6-0 with the plans, everyone would say Lincoln Riley's a genius. Now we look at Curt Cignetti and say, well, he's really got this locked down pat. He knows what he's doing. I think it's all about I think it's less about the travel and more about it's hard to play on the road, especially with these teams that USC is playing for the first time. They were en route to beating Minnesota, and I think that they would have actually won that game by a sizable margin when they were driving to go up by potentially 14 points right at the start of the fourth quarter. I remember saying to my broadcast partner on the radio, it sounds like a Minnesota drive right now. That's how quiet this Minnesota crowd, which had been rocking earlier, had gotten to that point because USC was just running the ball so effectively on the drive. Then one pass gets knocked up in the air and intercepted, and all of a sudden the Minnesota crowd is back in it. And then after that, it just didn't feel like USC played its best football when the crowd was against them. So you would say the same thing for Michigan. They quieted that crowd in the third quarter, but one Kalel Mullings run got the crowd back into it, and USC made some mistakes and couldn't eventually get the win. I think it's more about, hey, it's hard to play on the road, especially in this new conference, and USC is learning that, than it is about the travel. Because USC struggled on the road under Lincoln Riley last year in the Pac-12. I mean, they had trouble with the environment at Arizona State, of all places, and that's not even mentioning Utah and Oregon State and Oregon, places that really gave them trouble. I think playing on the road is hard in college football, and I think people are looking at these new conferences and they're taking their preconceived notions, the ones that were like, I really don't like this. They're going to have to travel so much. Now they see the traveling team lose and they say, well, now I really don't like it. This is the reason that these teams are losing. When in reality, most of the teams that lost when traveling 2 or more time zones, like the other team was favored. Like they were the team that mathematically, according to Vegas, was supposed to lose. Obviously, you saw Ohio State go in and lose as a favorite at Oregon, but that game could have gone either way. Penn State, USC could have gone either way. I think this is just kind of becoming the norm in the Big Ten.
USC, Michigan could have gone either way as well. I want to know what this Maryland crowd looks like because last week when Maryland played Northwestern, it was one of those standalone games on a Friday night. And the Maryland crowd, it looked to me like there were a good amount of people there, but Maryland just played so poorly that the crowd could never really get into the game. It's Maryland's homecoming game on Saturday. And if they're in this game early, I wonder if the crowd will be a factor at all. It's that 4 p.m. Eastern kick, so the lights will be going down as that game gets a little bit later, sort of similar to Minnesota in that regard, Jack. And those Minnesota fans absolutely made a big difference in that game at the end. So if Maryland is in it and it's close, I want to know what that crowd looks like because on paper, I don't really think, oh, we're going to Maryland. That's a really scary place to play. It doesn't really feel that way to me, but if USC allows Maryland to hang around and it is a tight game at the end, maybe that crowd will get into it and will be a factor. And that just goes back to what I was saying earlier. Like, don't let it get to that point. That's sort of been USC's problem this season. They had a chance to put Minnesota away. They had a chance to put Michigan away. They had a chance to put Penn State away, not at the end of the game, but before that when they were up 20-6, and they couldn't do it. They've let some of these teams hang around, and that's even more dangerous on the road when the crowd starts to believe a little bit, even if it's a Maryland who doesn't have that traditional home field advantage that we all think about. That can certainly be a big factor. So I don't know how much USC has in the tank to go in and come in and just, I don't want to say dominate, but just put a perfect game together and execute and do all the things that we say they need to do. But it would go a long way to making people believe again, and I think it's a big game in that regard.
Yeah, I think USC is certainly the hunted as well.
Yeah,
First
true.
season in the Big Ten, we've gone to some of these road trips and walking through the Minnesota students, like they care about beating USC because it's USC's first year in the conference and they want to give them a rude welcome. So maybe these Maryland fans will care a little bit more about, hey, this is the school's first ever meeting with USC, which I think is pretty surprising. But first ever matchup, we want to welcome them to the Big Ten. We want to win. Maybe they care a little bit more about a game like that than a Northwestern team they've seen before coming in on a Friday. If you're looking at the 2 weeks back to back, if you're a student, it's like, well, which game do I want to go out, tailgate for, get rowdy in the student section for? I could do this Friday, or I can wait till next week when USC comes to town. I think we've kind of seen that USC has been a target in the first year in the Big Ten going to some of these road places.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree with that 100%. And Ryan and I talked about it on Wednesday. The spot has not been good to USC. And what I mean by that, when you play Michigan, they've made that quarterback change. They had the real stinker 2 weeks earlier, then they stuck with their quarterback the following week to Arkansas State, and he played so poorly that they had to make a decision at the quarterback spot. They change it, and then they're playing for their college football playoff lives pretty much against USC, playing for their Big Ten championship lives. And what happens, they make a few more plays at the end and they win, but they really get up for that game. Minnesota was desperate when USC met them, and that, I think, was an unfortunate break for the Trojans when the previous couple weeks Minnesota just really didn't bring much to the table and they were lacking confidence a little bit. They were desperate. And now you play Maryland, where last week they had the stinker against Northwestern, where Maryland, they were one of the best teams in the nation in causing turnovers, and they're still really good in that, but last week against Northwestern, they have 4 turnovers. Northwestern has 0. They have that stinker game. They're awful after a bye week. Maryland has been historically. They get Northwestern off their bye. The spot really favors Northwestern, in my opinion. Now USC comes in, and they're going to get a hungrier, more desperate Maryland team. It's not like I'm trying to make an excuse for the Trojans, but between some of the officiating that we've seen, some of the spots that we've seen these games be in for the Trojans, they have had some bad luck. And Jack, that was something that we talked a little bit about on Wednesday. The injury stuff has been there too. It's sort of been that perfect storm, but the way to make everyone not talk about that, not talk about the travel, not talk about the spot, the injuries, all the stuff I just mentioned, go out, win, execute, do what you need to do, play the brand of football that USC fans expected after the Trojans beat LSU, and we're not talking about all that stuff. So they still control their own destiny in that regard. They can control the narrative here with a big win, but I do feel like there has been a lot working against USC, and sometimes you just have those seasons where that occurs.
Yeah, I 100% agree, but we also then made the pitch that this time the spot was in favor of USC last week. It was like Penn State has to come play a reeling USC team that has everything to play for. Looked like that in the first half. And then Penn State, because I think Penn State is the better team, came out and won the game in the second half. So there are times where USC has maybe been the benefactor of the spot, and the better team has come in and won the game, like the Penn State game. So I think that is definitely a good point that you make, and they've gotten all of these teams that are the wounded animals at home coming off of losses. I can't remember the last time that USC played somebody that was coming off of a win outside of Penn State. It just feels like every week they're getting a team that's looking to bounce back, and look, USC's right in the crosshairs after that. But I agree with the point that you make. Is there any on-field matchup that stands out to you most between USC and Maryland?
Sure. So I wanted to get into this great transition. I feel like it might be appropriate to try to make the case for USC and then make the case for Maryland. And I just guess I can start with Maryland because I watched that Northwestern game after I rewatched the USC Penn State game. So Maryland, like I said, they're limited. And I don't think they're as good as Minnesota, but I do think that it's not like this team is terrible. If USC doesn't play a good game, Maryland is certainly capable of beating them. But it would surprise me even more than USC losing to Minnesota. And we both agree, Jack. We thought USC would win that Minnesota game, but we gave Minnesota a shot. I give Maryland a smaller shot, but still a shot. They do a nice job of forcing turnovers. They're number 7th nationally in turnovers gained. They have 14 takeaways this year. We've seen USC and their losses struggle with takeaways. So the plan for Maryland, I think, or like the game plan, how they can potentially win, get a few turnovers from USC, and maybe they're in advantageous scoring position and they're able to punch the ball in. And then they have a great receiver in Ty Felton. If he was on USC, he'd be the best receiver, but by a long shot. You have to limit him. Billy Edwards, their quarterback, he's a solid quarterback. He's dealt with some pressure. He doesn't turn the ball over a ton, but like he's a guy you can slow down, but maybe the pass rush doesn't get there and he has some time to throw. He's a little bit dangerous with his legs, so he can extend plays. Those are sort of the 3 things I look at. You have to affect the quarterback, which Northwestern did a great job of doing that. If USC isn't able to, I could see Maryland getting some momentum. You have to stop Ty Felton, their great wide receiver, who has over 700 receiving yards so far this season. He's a weapon. Mike Loxley said he could have started when he was at Alabama. Felton was on those Alabama teams that had all those great receivers. He'd be right in the mix as well, so you need to slow him down. Don't let him have the kind of game that Tyler Warren did last week, and then limit the turnovers because Maryland's done a nice job of exposing teams who do put the ball in harm's way. So I look at that, but really, Jack, there's not one thing that Maryland does that I say, okay, they have this clear-cut advantage over USC. USC should be able to run the ball. USC should be able to pass the ball. Maryland's defense isn't great, and then when you flip it, it's Felton. He's sort of that matchup guy you need to slow down. But outside of him, they have a good second receiver, but they haven't been able to run the ball. Their quarterback is limited. That Felton's really the only guy where it's like, okay, that's a game breaker. You need to slow him down. So to me, it all comes back to USC. If they can just play up to the standard that we expect them to play to, they have better players. I believe they have the better coaching staff. And it's really a game that USC should win. So we'll see what happens. But I just feel like if USC plays up to its standard, they'll get the job done. I just threw a lot at you, so take whatever you want to take from that.
I think that the point for me, and this is the case with most games for USC, just force Maryland to play the game that Maryland has played all year. They'll give up 2 sacks a game on average, so 2 or maybe 3 sacks. That could be huge, especially for a USC pass rush that hasn't gotten home. You can't let your weakness be worse than their weakness.
Yep.
Like, they're bad at protecting the passer. You need to at least get 2 or 3 sacks in this game. They don't run the ball very well. let them try and pass it, but don't let them run the ball well. I think that's what USC has done a little bit this season is maybe they've gotten beat by the other team's strength. Like you look at Michigan in the run game and the defense. You look at Penn State using Tyler Warren, but just don't let teams kind of correct their own weaknesses when USC comes to town. You mentioned that Minnesota had that a little bit in the run game. But if Maryland can run the ball, and it's a team that's committed to passing the ball a lot like USC, that just opens up the entire offense. If they aren't giving up sacks, that really opens up the offense. So I think the key for me is just USC making Maryland play Maryland football, and that's what they've done this year. If Maryland gives up 2 sacks, even if they force a couple turnovers, if they still can't run the ball, like I don't see a path for Maryland to play the game it's normally played this year. I don't think that will be enough to beat USC. So the key for USC is just not letting the opponent, this week it's the Terrapins, get out of their shells. And no pun intended.
Yes, good pun there, and I think it was intended a little bit.
No.
I'm with you because we all know the blue chip ratio. If you follow that from Bud Elliott, he puts it out every season before play starts, and it's just these are the teams that historically have a chance to win the national championship because they have enough blue chip recruits on their roster to do so. Every team in the recruiting era has had, I think, over like 50% blue chip guys on their roster, something like that, and every season a team in the recruiting era has won that title, and USC's been on that list all these years. Like they just have a lot more talent than this Maryland team, and for as much grief as I've given Lincoln Riley for consistently saying we're close, they have been really close against some good teams. Penn State, of course, Michigan, maybe not as good as we thought. In Minnesota, they should have won those games, but they have been close, and they do have the talent, even with some of these injuries, to just be better and out-execute Maryland, and that's a big key to getting back on track here. Just do what you do, and that should be enough.
Yeah, I agree, and we mentioned that the LSU win was something that we'd like to see USC get back to. LSU hasn't lost since losing to USC. Like, that's a really good win. The key for USC is not allowing the fact that they're likely eliminated from the college football playoff. Again, it's the first year of the 12-team format. We don't really know what it's going to look like, but projecting, I'd say 99% USC is not making the playoff. They have to find a way to still make it a successful season. They need to find a way to redetermine what success is, because now if a playoff's out of the picture, that doesn't mean you fold and lose the final 6 games of the season. That's kind of what I'm going to be looking for as well, too, is has this team quit? I don't really think so, because we have seen them play incredibly hard and fight incredibly hard, and from everything we've heard, the culture seems to be in the right place. So I don't think this is a team that's just going to lay on its back because they're eliminated from playoff contention. But that's something that I'm going to be looking for from the first snap is this team still mentally in it, despite the fact that chance-wise of winning the national championship or making the playoff, or especially the Big Ten championship game, that's out the window, in my opinion. I'm just interested to see how they respond and interested to see whether this team comes out flat or whether they come out with the same juice that they would have if they were still undefeated.
That's how we started the show, and yeah, I'm with you there, because you don't want to predict a team's going to check out, but like, would it be shocking if USC didn't play great in this game?
Year.
Yeah, and I do think the problems on last year's team were worse than the problems on this year's team. It's really tough to do anything when you have defensive coaches who just don't put you in positions to succeed. And even though USC, they have some holes defensively due to injuries and just due to some of the recruiting weaknesses that they've had, unquestionably, this coaching staff puts the defense in better positions to succeed. And for all the grief, a lot of the fans, and hey, I've been guilty of it too, of giving Riley, I still feel like he's an exceptional offensive coach. So you just put that together, and that should be enough this week. But mentally, like, our guys checked out. I hope not, but at 3-3, a really bitter, disappointing loss last week. It's not something I rule out, but I agree with you, Jack. That would surprise me. Riley talks so much in the offseason about the culture of this team. We remember the Greedy Vance tweet in the offseason. I've been around a lot of locker rooms, been around a lot of teams. Nothing's felt like this. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but it was something like that. Guys have really bought in. This team loves each other, and they love Miller Moss. Like, I buy into all of that. And yes, they haven't performed as well as people expected, but that chemistry, like, that's where this week against Maryland on the road, that's where that should matter. And if that chemistry is there the way everyone has said it is, then we'll see that play out this week.
Shotgun had put in the chat that USC's been given a 9.1% chance, according to Vegas, to still make the playoffs. So maybe it's not exactly 99% that they're out, but certainly feels like it.
I think we got to get that out of our head. I heard Shotgun talk about that on the show the other night, but I don't know if this team has what it takes to win out. I don't think anyone realistically should think that, but maybe I'm in the wrong there. Like they have been close, but man,
I mean, even if they win out, I'm not sure this is the year a three-loss team makes it. You'd have wins over Notre Dame, LSU, and like your next best win after that's maybe against Nebraska at home, maybe Washington on the road. Washington, another team that's 3-3 right now. I just don't know. Like, I don't think a 3-loss team's going to make it, especially if you're a 3-loss team that doesn't have huge wins. And I don't think USC would exactly have those. They'd have probably 2 of them, but that's about it.
Well, the LSU win could help. So I guess never say never. I just don't think they will go undefeated the rest of the way. The injury, like if they had the full roster and they've just had some unfortunate blows, yes, I could see it. But I just think they've taken too many injuries, and that to me is something you can't overcome. The season-ending injuries that they've had to deal with this season have been brutal on the defensive side of the ball, and I feel so bad for those guys because we saw what it looks like against LSU, and it looked really good. Yeah,
and those guys were hugely helping their draft stock, Eric Gentry and Anthony Lucas. We can get into questions, and the first one does come from Cameron about those two guys. He says, who needs to step up on the defense with the loss of both Gentry and Lucas?
Well, I guess we can start with Gentry. It's going to be a lot of Mason Cobb, a lot of Easton Mascarenas-Arnold, Anthony Beavers. We've seen Kamari Ramsey come play closer to the box and have Zion Branch and Akili Arnold play as more natural safeties. So Ramsey, of course, isn't a linebacker, but he's helped fill that void a little bit. And then Desmond Stevens. So those guys. And then on the edge, Jamil Muhammad led USC in sacks last year, doesn't have one so far this season. So I look at him. I look at all the edge rushers. I mean, Jack, you tweeted it. What do they have? 1.5 sacks combined?
So the top 3 guys rotationally were Lucas, Muhammad, and Braylon Shelby. And those 3 had combined for 2.5 tackles for loss and 1 sack.
So tough for that, but maybe it's Sam Green, maybe Solo steps up, Cam Fountain. Could we see Lorenzo Cowan come in and play? I don't know if I expect that to happen, but you have a pretty good stable of edge rushers here, even without Anthony Lucas, and it just needs to be one of those guys. If I had to make a prediction, I'd probably say Braylon Shelby because he has the highest ceiling, but he's been a little, I don't want to say disappointing, but just the production is what the production is, and no one has really been great in that regard. Anthony Lucas pressured the quarterback a lot, but didn't have a tackle for loss, didn't have a sack. I get the question, who's it going to be? It could be anyone because no one's really done it so far.
Yeah, and Anthony Lucas provided a lot of things that wouldn't show up on a stat sheet. Great
Against
at taking
LSU,
on blocks,
he was great.
Keeping contained, good in run defense. I think if you're looking at who has to step up on the edge, it's the 2 guys that will probably be starting, and that's Braylon Shelby and Jamil Muhammad. Shelby has as much promise as anyone in that room and just hasn't put it together yet. And Jamil Muhammad, you mentioned he led USC in sacks last year, so he had 6.5 for the season. 6 of them came in the first half of the year. So at this point last year, he had 6 sacks, and the rest of the way he had just a half. So right now, halfway through, he doesn't have one. He has shown he can put together a stretch of 6 games where he goes off of the edge. But you're looking at the last 12 games for him, and it's half of a sack. You can't have that on the edge. I mean, any player at any school, if you're rushing off the edge, you have to have more than half a sack over a 12-game span, which is the length of a full regular season. But if you're looking at the 2 guys that need to step up, it's Jamil Muhammad and Braylon Shelby. The guys that you might see a little bit more of, it's going to be Sam Green. You might see a little bit more Cam Fountain just because he hasn't played really at all since that Utah State game. And then guys like Solomon Tuliaupupu, he might play a little bit more off of the edge. But specifically the guys that need to step up are Shelby and Muhammad.
I don't know if they can afford to put Devin Tompkins on the edge, but maybe in some packages you try him there because he's had some success getting to the quarterback from the interior. Danton Lynn's talked about he feels like he's more of a natural defensive tackle than edge rusher. But could that help solve some of USC's problems? He is a lot bigger and he's bulked up, so the speed, I wonder if that would hurt him playing more of an edge position. But, I mean, he has the production, so I look at him maybe as someone who could step up too.
Yeah, I would agree. I just don't know if USC can take from one area of weakness to help another one. That's the problem is just they're not very deep on the defensive line right now. With Bear Alexander leaving, they're not deep at D-tackle. They're not deep on the edge. Obviously, I think linebacker's a place where they're good, just still not super deep. Secondary, they've got a bunch of guys. Secondary will be fine. I think that's the strength right now. If you're looking at, honestly, maybe the entire team, that's the secondary and the running backs have been the two position groups where you go into most weeks and you don't really have many questions about them. But a good point by Roger Dodger as well. Elijah Hughes, we haven't really seen anything from him this year. It doesn't really seem like he's doing enough in practice to get reps, but he's a guy that off the edge and on the defensive line got pressure at the beginning of last year, has promise like Braylon Shelby, so maybe that's a guy we see a few more snaps from.
That's a confusing one as to why we haven't seen him at all when it seems like they've been desperate for bodies, but I just think Jahdae Abasiri is outplaying him right now, and that's why he's in and Elijah hasn't been in. It is a homecoming for Elijah Hughes from the DMV area with Sam Green as well. Yeah. So maybe we'll see those guys pop in front of some friends and family. That could be fun.
Cannon JE on YouTube says, do you think at the end of a close game with Lincoln Riley having to call plays but also assess the strategy, like when to call a timeout, that this has been an issue for USC?
I think that's a great question, and one of my favorite talk show hosts has this take that the offensive coaches who call the plays, sometimes they can be guilty of having their heads buried in the play sheet and not exactly understanding the situation. Now, I don't think that applied to Riley against Penn State, but in general, can that hurt you? Sure it can. That's why CEO head coaches have a lot of success, I think, historically. So I definitely get that question, and I think at times it has hurt USC. But I've made this point. I made it Wednesday. I made it on Instant Analysis. I didn't have a huge problem with what Lincoln Riley did because if they don't convert on plays before that and they have to kick the ball away to Penn State and they use those timeouts, then Penn State would have had some time to go down the field and potentially win the game themselves. So I think that is a good question, and it certainly is something we should watch for, and maybe in the past it has hurt USC, but I felt like Riley had a good his hand on the pulse, whatever the expression is, a finger on the pulse. I thought he understood the situation, and he wanted to give USC a chance to have a walk-off win, and if they just execute that third down, they would have. So I didn't have a huge issue with it, but I get the question, and that's certainly something to watch.
Yeah, I agree. I think with the plan that they had, they managed the time correctly. My one question goes back to, is that the right plan to take in that moment? They were at midfield. They had 2 minutes left. I personally, like when I'm looking at it, I think you'd rather lose with your best side of the ball on the field, and that's supposed to be the offense. So I think, at midfield, playing for a field goal with that much time left, I'm just not sure if that was the greatest plan. I didn't mind the clock management once they decided what they wanted to do, but the offense was moving and had been moving for the last two drives, and kind of one negative run where they got walled at the line of scrimmage threw off everything, and it felt like USC just decided to play for a field goal, play really conservatively after that. That's the question. Like, that's the thing I have a question on. But in terms of actually using the timeouts and clock management, I think they did the right thing once they decided what the plan was.
Yeah.
Jasper on YouTube says, any news on Lake McCree, that's tight end for USC, I feel like he would have been the guy who could have been the difference in those three losses.
Riley said today that it sounded like he wasn't going to play this weekend. He said he's recovering better than we thought, but I don't know for sure if he'll be available. He didn't rule it out, so there's a chance we see Lake McCree. And Jack, we saw him in practice Wednesday. He looked good to go to me.
Yeah, he was moving well.
But Riley didn't say today for sure that he's going to play. And if McCree does play, I wonder if Riley said that to try to throw Maryland off. But he's been pretty truthful about injuries so far this season. Nothing really has surprised me based on the description that he's given about a player's status. So based on what he said today, I would be surprised if McCree played against Maryland. But it wasn't ruled out by Riley. So maybe like a 15% chance he plays, 85% chance he doesn't, something like that.
Yeah, but he said if he doesn't play this week, like he's fairly certain he would be back next week, which is what they said was around the plan for him once he went down during the Michigan game. He said, a hit like that, you're happy to get him back at any point. And he was on pace, maybe they thought, to come back around this week or next week. So seems like he's on pace, but, I agree. I think he would be a difference.
Yeah.
You've seen over the last 2 weeks, USC has combined for 0 tight end catches and 0 tight end receiving yards. And you see the tight end for Penn State go for 17 catches, 224 yards and a touchdown. So they need to get more out of the tight end position. And I think he likes a little bit of what he's seen from Cade Eldridge and Walker Lyons, at the very least in terms of their resilience and stepping into spots that's pretty uncomfortable for a guy that doesn't have those two guys not having a lot of college football experience. But getting Lake McCree back, I agree, would open up the offense a lot. Trojan Kevin on YouTube says, if each of you could change one thing about the offense and the defense to get them going in the right direction, what would it be? Is this like you want to play this like if we had a magic ball that, like I'm struggling, like, can we just say get more sacks, or is this more a foundational change that could lead them to success like that?
Good question. I would probably say use Quentin Joyner more.
Yeah, I would
guess.
agree. Or at the very least, just keep the ball on the ground a little bit more. Not be afraid to run on second down and just run the ball more. I'd like to see a little bit more balance between rush attempts and pass attempts offensively.
Maybe call more run plays for Miller Moss so everyone quiets down about that and gets off my back on me defending Miller.
He's been wearing a pretty big knee brace that I'm not sure they really want him running around.
Yeah, so I'd say run more with Joyner, because realistically, it's not like there's some stud receiver on the bench who's not playing a lot. There's some stud offensive lineman who doesn't have his S together and they could rely on, but he's not ready to go. Like, they kind of are what they are at this point. So I go to Joyner. He's sort of the one obvious guy to me who hasn't been utilized as much as maybe he should be, but he did fumble against Minnesota, so I get why he wasn't. And then defensively, to get them going in the right direction, I mean, it's a cop-out, but get Eric Gentry back. I just think
find a cure for concussions.
Yeah, he's just such an emotional leader for them, and he was such a big, impactful piece. Yeah, I'll kind of steal what you said, Jack. I think establishing a pass rush is so important because the secondary is good, but you can be the best secondary in the world, and a receiver will eventually get open. So USC, they need to get people going. So I'll say, hey, utilize Quentin Joyner more for offense. I'll just throw it out there. Let's utilize Cameron Fountain more on defense as an edge rusher. Maybe that'll be the trick, but I do think there's a reason he hasn't been playing. I don't know what the magic fix is there. Danton Lynn said we're going to continue to really try to attack protection, so he wants to schematically try to get to the quarterback more, but whatever they've tried hasn't really worked to this point. That's been the biggest weakness in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're looking defensively there. It's not like there's one player where you're looking, well, this guy needs to get more snaps. We really want to see this guy play more. There's Quentin Joyner on offense for that, but I don't think there's that easy fix defensively. I think I really liked their plan. It felt like they went back to that LSU plan of bend, don't break last week against Penn State, so they would allow Penn State to move down the field, but they'd really get stingy in the red zone. That's the same thing they did to LSU, and it's the reason they beat LSU, and it's the reason they were so close to beating Penn State. I like that plan. I thought they gave up big plays in that stretch against Michigan and Minnesota and even against Wisconsin because they were getting really aggressive, maybe getting a little bit cocky and trusting guys in one-on-one coverage, no safety help, and that led to the big Wisconsin touchdown. So maybe realizing that that's a good plan, especially when you don't have your main guys, playing a little bit of a softer shell and then figuring it out in the red zone to play bend, don't break. I like that plan. So if I had to give an answer defensively, maybe that's what I would say. Jay Cruz 23 on YouTube says, do you guys think Riley needs to hire an offensive coordinator in the future so we can do actual head coach duties instead of focusing on the offensive things?
I just don't think he'll ever do it. His superpower is developing quarterbacks and the play calling. And I understand people have been frustrated with him this season and dating back to last season with some of the offensive stuff. It hasn't looked like those traditional Lincoln Riley offenses where it's just a billion points. And at some points last year it did look like that. But specifically this season, that really hasn't come through. So I get the question. I just don't think – like Riley's going to do what he thinks is best. And in my opinion, what he believes is best is him calling the plays, and I don't see that changing. So could that help? Maybe, but that's a tough dynamic, and I wouldn't see it unless things really got desperate here.
I think if you bring in an offensive coordinator and Riley's not calling the plays, I think he would do a better job as a head coach if he didn't also have to call plays. The question is, are you finding an offensive coordinator that's even close to as good as calling plays as he is? I'm not sure you're finding that right now, especially where he is still the offensive mastermind, so the offensive coordinator would kind of just be there to just call the plays. He wouldn't have as much of a full offensive coordinator role, so you're not landing some super big splash hire. I think someone put Todd Monken in the chat earlier. It's that guy's the offensive coordinator for the Baltimore Ravens. He's not coming to be the number two that just gets to call plays during game time. So I don't disagree on the fact that Lincoln Riley would probably be a better situational head coach if he wasn't also calling plays. But the offense would take a downturn, and it's already started to falter a little bit over the last year and a half or so. So I think you would damage the offense, and I'm not sure that it's worth it at that point.
And it's just not how the staff is set up. Like, has anyone historically ever called plays on their offensive staff? Maybe somewhere at a smaller school, but it's been a long time for a lot of those guys. I mean, Simmons has been with Riley for so long. Maybe Luke Heward has called plays in a prior life, but I don't think Zach Hansen has, and Josh Henson was a tight ends coach and an offensive line coach for a long time. They don't have anyone like built in who, if Riley didn't want to make an outside hire, hey, you call the plays. Just the infrastructure, it's so much about what Riley does as a play caller and just how he runs his offense. So, I mean, I don't want Riley to go anywhere. I know he's had some trouble this season, and some fans might feel differently, but like, I feel like it would either be Riley calls the plays or he's not the head coach. And I don't see that happening either.
Yeah. Maurice asked a quick question. Is Bear Alexander really going to transfer, or will he come back to USC in 2025?
That ship has sailed.
Yeah, I think they'd be crazy to let him come back. But that's all we've got for questions. Throw the comment up by Jasper. He says, hit the like button. We really appreciate you guys fully tuning into the show. And if you've made it to this point, you guys are the real fans, and we'd appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe. But Connor, to round things out, USC is favored by 7 points. At least that's a spread we are using on the site. Does feel like a little bit of a low number, but USC is 3-3, going on the road, long trip. Where do you feel on the spread and on this game in general for USC?
I'm trying to get an updated spread here, but I think that USC is going to win by 10 points. That's sort of how I felt about this game. Yeah, still at 7.5, because like I felt like the season was on the line last week, and they get so close and they still lose. Like, now the season is like really on the line, and the college football playoff is probably out of the picture. But I said this on Wednesday: if you lose to Maryland, like that's like an evaluate everything kind of situation. So the college football playoff was on the line last week. Now it's like the Lincoln Riley tenure and like the Miller Moss tenure and some of these guys on defense, like who we had such high hopes for. Like, if you lose against Maryland, then it's play the freshman. Let's just see what you have going forward. And I don't want to be at that spot when you still have 5 games left. Like, there still is a lot to play for USC this season. If they're able to beat Maryland, you can still spoil Notre Dame's potential college football playoff run and the rivalry with UCLA. And I mean, Washington looks better. That's a fun matchup on paper. This game, to me, it's all hands on deck, get things back going in the right direction. So I think USC wins by 10, and I think they need to win by 10 or more, because it's time to get people to try to buy back in a little bit. Riley needs this. His rating right now with the fans isn't very good. People are down on Miller Moss. Like, it's time to shut everyone up and go out and play really well. And Maryland, in my opinion, it's on the road, but it's a good opponent to do that. You're not really going to face a team like Maryland going forward. I think every other opponent except for UCLA is probably more talented. Rutgers has had some injuries. Like, this is a game you got to go out and make a statement, being 3-3, and I have the faith that they will, because, you know, I didn't pick them to be a great team this year, but I still feel like they've been better than I expected and better than they've shown. They deserve to probably not be 3-3, but they are. Let's go out and prove it.
Yeah, I agree. I think I like more than 10 points, somewhere 14 or 17. And Northwestern came in and beat this Maryland team by 20-plus points. And it's not like it was at Northwestern. You know, this was a Friday game at Maryland. Friday games are notoriously way harder on the team that's traveling, and it didn't seem to hamper Northwestern all that much. And I don't think Northwestern's the most excellent football program. But with the points that we mentioned of Maryland taking this one seriously, and the fans, you know, probably putting a target on USC's back, maybe they don't go in there and just completely blow them out. But I'm definitely taking USC -7. I feel like maybe a little bit of a disrespectful spread, and Vegas trying not to go too far into USC's comeback, just knowing what they've seen. And USC has played close games against everybody, really, except Utah State. But I think this is a game where USC goes in and exercises some demons. Not going to say it's a huge blowout, but somewhere between 14 and 17 points, I think USC goes and wins by. And I think that, as we mentioned at the top of the show, they just need it. They need a win, first of all. They don't care if it's by 100 points or 1 point. They need a win, but I also think it could be a pretty cathartic experience for them to go in there and get a 2-score win, maybe a 17-point win. That would be really big for this team right now that is dealt with a lot of frustrations throughout the entirety of the year.
And we've heard so much from the players and Riley too. Like, I love playing on the road. I love coaching on the road. These are the environments we want to be in, and we love getting those opposing fans upset. Like, let's see that. Let's see that play out. I think they just desperately need this, and I hope that desperation fuels a big victory, because this still is a team that does have a lot to play for, even though they're 3-3. And I just go back to what I said earlier, like you lose and then the calls for a quarterback change, a coaching change, like then it gets deafening. This is a game you need to win to get people back in your circle, even if it doesn't totally get people back in. It does a lot more harm than good if you lose this week to a Maryland team that realistically could lose the rest of their games this season and go 3-9. So you can't drop this one.
Totally agree. We appreciate you guys for taking the time to watch. Ryan's already on his way to Maryland. He was 6 hours delayed on his flight. Shonkin will drive down there. Chris got over there on Wednesday. So we're holding down the fort here in Los Angeles before heading over to Maryland. There is a meetup in Maryland if you want to go tomorrow night. I don't remember the details, Connor. I don't know if you can pull that up if you have easy access.
I should be able to here.
It's a big one. If you're a fan of the meetups, definitely go to this one, because this is the Chris Trevino meetup. I know he kind of planned it out. It's back in his college town, back in his home state, so he'll be having fun. If you ever want to go up and talk to Chris, this is like the week to do it. So I don't know, were you able to find it?
Yes, so tomorrow, October 18th, starting at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time at Tom's Watch Bar, National Harbor. Don't know a lot about the DMV area, but if you do, or you don't, and you're just planning to be there, it's at Tom's Watch Bar in National Harbor. I don't know what National Harbor means, but I will be there too. Jack, hope to see you there as well. These are really fun. I've had a blast at these last couple, and it's awesome to talk to USC fans. And there's usually some pretty good college football games on.
No Syracuse on this week.
No,
they play every other Friday,
yes,
it seems.
Yes, and hey, they might not be the most talented team, although I think they're 5-1, but they're entertaining at least. We got a crappy Big Ten game. It's Purdue hosting Oregon, I think.
Hey, you never know what Purdue has pulled off some big wins like that, and teams have to go to Purdue. Not predicting a win.
I hope, but
I think they beat a number 2 Ohio State team one year that had to go in and play Purdue. So
I don't know about this Purdue regime right now,
Yeah,
Jack. They
I
are
disagree.
probably the worst team in the Big Ten, and I just really crapped on Maryland. So I think this team's a lot worse than Maryland.
yeah,
There.
I agree. Easily the worst team in the Big Ten.
Yeah.
It's a fist fight between UCLA and Purdue's whooping some ass right now in that fist fight. But thank you guys so much for watching the show. We really appreciate you guys taking the time, leaving your questions and comments. We hope to see some of you guys out there in Maryland, but we'll be back in studio to recap the game on Sunday after USC takes on Maryland. 4 p.m. Eastern, so it's 1 p.m. Pacific on FS1, I believe, as USC faces Maryland for the first time ever. But for Connor Morrissette, I'm Jack Smith. Thank you guys for watching Tunnel Vision, and we'll see you next time. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday night.